Greetings everyone, and welcome to the AI World Summit 2020, organized by MyFinB Group. We'd like to thank you for attending this session today entitled Boards in the New Era, How AI Can Help Achieve Effectiveness in the Boardroom. Here is the background. Consistent with the current trend, boards are increasingly heading towards AI and machine learning adoption to improve the quality of their decision-making process. The relationship between humans and machines to work together via augmented intelligence is gradually becoming a reality. However, the key questions remain. Can AI be used to support board functions from a governance, risk, and compliance perspective? Can AI be used to predict the future demise or potential scale of a company? This track looks at how practitioners and adopters are using AI to create impact for boards and management personnel. We are deeply honored today to have our panel of speakers from UAE, New Zealand and Australia. This session is chaired and moderated by Adjunct Professor Paul Chan, who is based in Malaysia. Professor Paul is the president and founding board member of Malaysian Alliance of Corporate Directors. Our esteemed panelists comprise of Ayub Mohammed Zaveri, who is the CEO of the Trust with Trade Group. We also have Mark Rowley, the Chief Operating Officer of Centrix Group. Next, we have Jane Diplock, Chairman of Abu Dhabi Global Market Regulatory Committee, Board Director at Singapore Exchange Limited, Chairman Governance and Nominations Committee at International Integrated Reporting Council, Director of Australian Financial Services Group Party Limited. Last but not least, we have Andrew Donovan, Principal, Thor Post Governance, Founding Partner, Consiglia, Managing Director, Directors Suite. Without much further ado, I leave the digital stage to the chairperson and moderator of this track to continue our track session. Over to you, Professor Paul.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Yes,
Hi,
we can.
Paul.
Very good. Yeah, very good. Thank you very much, Adjunct Professor Nazri. Now, the voice that you heard just now was actually a Robo Master of Ceremony, Robo MC. You can imagine that this AI Summit probably is driven by all the robos, right? Of course, not Nazri himself, but as he and his team must have constructed a whole conference. Must be on the AI platform. Is it right, Nasri? Congratulations.
Augmented platform, human machine.
Okay, the interaction of human and machine, which is very, very important, of course. In fact, when I look at 14 tracks running in parallel, I take my hat off to you, Nasri.
It's 31, by the way. It's 31 sessions, 14 conferences, and plus other supporting special presentation.
Exactly. That's what I cannot imagine that without using the AI platform, you can do all such a array of sessions. Anyway, thank you for inviting me to moderate on this session. I would like to before I proceed, just a little bit of my own background. All right, I'm actually I'm a CPA by profession. All right, but now I serve with several boards, public and private boards. And through this experience, we have seen a lot of things, right? How the business has developed, how the market has changed, how the VR, and the board has imposed so many responsibilities, right? We are carrying a lot of liabilities, despite that we talk about all the benefits that we get, you know. So, and a very basic thing, I would say, you know, the reason for people doing business, so entrepreneurs who move into the business, is actually the very definition of it. They are managing the capital they put into the business. In other words, they're managing capital risk, right? They filter down the whole thing. That is what they're trying to do to eventually enhance the value of the assets, enhance the value of the investment. Now, in the process, a lot of things has happened. They've taken care of a lot of things, all right? The market has changed. Technology has changed that impacts so much on the company, the business that they do. In fact, there's one report from the S&P 500 that states that, 45 years or 50 years ago, the life cycle of a company was on average 75 years, all right? Today, the life cycle of a company has gone down to 15 years, and it's still going down, meaning that a lot of business today are really been decimated by all these changes. And technology is one of those that impact into the board. So as a director of a company where we have responsibility to fiduciary responsibility and duties of the company, right, to safeguard the value of the assets. This definition, all this have changed because of the market have changed. So how do we manage all those things, right? And not only that, when technology change, the market change, you have to consider the human capital that we have. Are we going to invest more in reskilling or upskilling the human capital? In fact, now the new term they use is called new skilling, where you have to skill your human capital in areas that is non-existent for the last 5 years or 10 years, right? This is where the board fiduciary responsibility extend to that level as well. Now, at the same time, you realize that the market become more and more regulated, especially public listed company where we are so much regulated by the regulators with the good intention of protecting the investors' interests. At times you find that the regulation itself may be very, very cumbersome to a certain extent that it stifles the entrepreneurial spirit of the entrepreneurs in creating value for the company. So in the midst of all these things, what is the question that we need to raise to ourselves? To me is that we ought to look at the changes in such a way that sometimes I look at it, the corporate governance principles, which we all embrace, are very important principles, but things have moved on. Besides being all compliance to the regulated structure of corporate governance, we are looking into the next level of adaptive governance. We ought to be very much more adaptive to the changes in the marketplace. And that is where we have so many things as board members to look into. How are we going to make sense of all this data, all this information coming into play that help us to discharge our fiduciary responsibilities to the company, to the shareholders, to the stakeholders, and a larger perspective to the society? That is a big question. When things are moving so fast, we really need not only enabling tool to help us to make decisions faster. In fact, I would look at it this way. AI has become not only an enabling tool for the board, it has become a strategic imperative moving into that direction, without which it's not a question of whether we want to adopt or don't want to adopt. The market itself will shift, will push us towards that direction. So in that context, I would like to introduce the various speakers for this session. We are very, very experienced people who are in the marketplace, and I would like to introduce them one by one as they take on to the session. Now, each speaker can take about 20, 25 minutes. We have 3 speakers. The first one I'd like to introduce to you is from New Zealand, Mr. Mark Rowley. Is Mark Rowley there? Yes, good, all right. I think it's better if I introduce each one of you one by one before you take over the session, all right? Then I will wrap it up after all you have taken the session. So Mark Rowley has over 20 years experience in the credit management industry with extensive knowledge of international credit bureau systems. He has held a number of senior managerial roles in the credit bureau industry, both locally and internationally. Mark was instrumental in the development of the New Zealand credit bureau industry in the late 80s and 90s, including the transition to online data delivery and industry consolidation. And leveraging on his experience in bureau development, he moved to Southeast Asia in 2002 to oversee the technology delivery of the Malaysian Credit Bureau of Bank Negara, that's a Malaysian central bank, and the development of Singapore's Bank Credit Bureau. He was appointed the General Manager of Credit Bureau Singapore, 2003 to 2007. As a proven specialist in business startup, he has demonstrable skills in business and strategic planning, plan execution, sales negotiation, and relationship management. Mark returned to New Zealand in 2008 and is a founder of Centrix Group, a leading data analytics and credit bureau operations. His current role is Chief Operating Officer. So Mark, I will over to you before I introduce the rest. When you finish, I will introduce the rest. Okay, Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Yep, thank you, Paul. Appreciate that. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see everyone online. Thanks, Nazri, for organising this thing. It seems very impressive, especially from my little corner of the world. You know, when we talk about board directors, and Paul just touched on it, and really where we're going from a board perspective, you know, my feel is that many directors are well behind in AI language literacy, and yet at the same time, we need to make a determination as to whether AI can help improve our companies overall. So it's not an easy task. Our companies, I guess it's 10 years old now, and I see, Paul, you just said that I've got a life objective of 15 years, so we've not got far to go, so we better get ourselves sorted. But you know, when we're talking about AI at the board level, the first thing that sort of sprung to mind for us was revenue forecasting, and it's a common problem made more difficult globally due to COVID lockdowns and economic disruption. So what we found in our part of the world, that most of our forecasts turned out to be overly pessimistic, and I don't know whether you've experienced similar in your part of the world. So this obviously largely stems from the ramifications of a global pandemic. You know, I think that in reality what happened is emotional bias played a major role. So we're not feeling good, we don't know what's happening in the world, and that then we sort of curve fitted into our predictions. So whilst I didn't have it in play, one wonders what AI could have done if we're using it in a forecasting model. You know, in all likelihood, I'm thinking that it would have produced a better version 1 forecast simply by removing that emotional bias. And then the other things really we've discussed at a board level is where could AI come into play? So we're looking at clearly audit and risk, P&L balance sheet, you know, liquidity monitoring, debt provisioning, etc. You know, and I think all these things hold a lot of potential. However, we've got to appreciate that this is a new competency. And, you know, I look around my board and we're saying, well, actually, you know, who's got the experience to have oversight of AI, and how would we use it? So employing AI to enhance the board's decision-making capabilities and its understanding and analysis will become more and more the norm. And we've got to consider, does it make sense to use AI from a technical perspective? Can AI help us make more accurate and strategic decisions? And when you consider those factors, you know, the boards make ultimately pretty complex decisions for your organization, and it's important that these decisions are based on fact. But can AI help boards make faster and more accurate and unbiased decisions? So it's going to be pretty clear, I think, going forward, there's going to be a greater need for scenario planning in a world remade by COVID-19. AI is likely to be at the forefront of this planning. And also we've seen, you know, in the last few years, greater increased calls for board and oversight in terms of cyber, culture, sustainability. So those are just a few areas for us to consider. Ultimately, when considering any new technology and how that might, you know, pave the way for our organizations, we've got to accept there are risks. And, you know, we'll be increasingly called upon to address an emerging area of oversight responsibility at that intersection of AI and ethics. So from a board perspective, you know, we've got to consider the ethical risk, and that, you know, that includes fairness. Will AI result in discriminatory outcomes? Transparency, responsibility and accountability, and I think that's a big one. Who's accountable for unintended outcomes in AI? Robustness, reliability, you know, what measures we have in place, and clearly, you know, privacy, and ultimately trust. do AI systems retain the trust with customers, employees, and our external stakeholders? So these are sort of the things that we were talking about from just our board and our little corner of the world and our startup model. Really, how can AI impact our business? What are our principles and frameworks? Who oversees the use of AI within the organization? And what guardrails do we have in place? I worry whether we have the adequate skills on the board at this time. So I think we've clearly got to employ the right people and make sure we have the right experience on board. And we're all going to also consider how we're collaborating our ecosystem with our business partners and suppliers, because that's key. Because if we're doing something left field and they don't understand, then we're just simply going to lose business. So thanks, Paul. That's my opening gambit.
Good. Thank you very much, Mark. I think you raised a lot of very, very pertinent questions, which perhaps we may not have all the answers at the moment. As you realize, even through history, technology always run ahead of us, and regulators is always catching up with technology, together in the marketplace, of course. When you talk about risk management, you talk about responsibility, of the confidentiality. You talk about whether you have adequate skills. All these are out in the field right now, right? But the thing is that when technology moves ahead, whether we want to come along or not, or whether you want to embrace it and adapt it or adopt it, it will go ahead on its own. The bottom line is the responsibility that we have as board of directors is always, if you filter down the whole thing, is a fiduciary responsibility to safeguard the value of the assets of the company and to enhance that value, right? So all this new technology does impose onto us that certain level of risk. But the big question is that, can we afford just have not to look into that in order to be at the forefront of the curve, As I also look at it, we often talk about we use technology as an enabler. But the more I look at it, the more I'm convinced that technology is a strategic differentiator. Not only just a strategic enabler for us to run a business, but also a strategic differentiator. So there are many questions that you raised which are very pertinent, and perhaps some of our panelists can also take some of those questions that you have raised. But before that, perhaps I can introduce now the next person is Andrew Donovan. Just very briefly, Andrew Donovan is a company director and business advisor specializing in organizations experience high level of growth, change, or complexity. He's a former chair of Barker Trailers, manufacturer of the world-class semi-trailers. Right? He's a member of the independent nomination committees of Victoria Teacher Mutual Bank. Now, for the last 15 years, 2004 to 2019, Andrew was a senior facilitator for the Australian Institute of Company Directors in Australia and Asia, and a facilitator for the advanced level programs, Mastery in Boardroom and Board Ready. He has authored several institute educational programs and publications. Andrew is a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and a graduate of the Company Directors course. He holds a Bachelor of Commerce from the Australian National University. So Andrew, you can comment on what Mark said, or you can present your perspective of the topic today. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much.
Yes.
Thanks very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here, and welcome and hello to everybody that's online and all the participants. I might weave in some of my comments. Yes, we've got Mark saying very similar perspectives in some ways, so I'll add in, I suppose, some difference. But I think if I could first of all reinforce, Paul, what you've been saying, and also I sat in briefly for 15 minutes or so with the previous speaker, Dr. Bo Lin, who sort of said nothing endures except change, and I thought that sort of very similar to the sort of initial quote I wanted to give, which is out of a paper from MIT Sloan on artificial intelligence in the boardroom, where they sort of said, while technology is growing exponentially, leaders and boards are only changing incrementally, leaving many legacy organizations further and further behind. And they then argued, it's time for leaders to courageously admit that despite all their years of experience, AI does belong in the boardroom. And I think we do have that first hurdle to overcome, is that there's some sense of entitlement or sense of certainty about your experience and wisdom in the boardroom. And we shouldn't let go of that. There is enormous value there, but AI has a lot to offer. I think it has a lot to offer in three sort of areas, or three roles of the board. And then Mark's touched on some great examples where they hit that opportunity. So the three roles of the board that I've touched on, one is around board's decision-making role. And that's, Paul, your sort of point about it being a strategic differentiator. And really the type of AI or the type of machine learning or data analytics that we use can differentiate us. Then there's the assurance side, and perhaps that's more of the enabler side, to your point, Paul, which is how we can use all of those technologies in our assurance role. But then in order to do both of those well, and it goes to both Paul and Mark's point about capability of the board, I think we can use AI actually on the board itself. Often we want AI to be used anywhere but in the boardroom, like we're happy to use it on the organisation or on the market or on the environment, but I actually think there's a place for using AI on ourselves, which I'll touch on briefly. So I think, when we look at the question of, we first of all got to weigh up in decision-making in particular, do we use it, when do we use AI? And it's really a way up between, when does machine smarts trump human smarts, and when does human smarts trump machine smarts? And I think we have to be mindful. I'm an AI convert, but not an AI expert. And when I talk about the suite of technologies available to boards, it's a continuum. And many of the experts say to me, look, there's not actually a lot of genuine AI around. We've got a lot of machine learning, we've got a lot of data analytics, and we've got a growing body of AI, but we're still got a whole suite of technologies that we could utilize. So just to put that out there, some of my examples aren't yet ready to be enabled or driven by AI, but they certainly are by machine learning and by data. So, but our strength, if we think about our strength, so when does human smarts outweigh machine smarts? It's really in that intuitive ability. That's when we actually process a lot of information sources, one of those quite quickly, and they're quite different information sources. So there's data, we can have some processing capacities around data, but we also have our experience. We also have, importantly, our understanding of relationships and the way relationships work, human relationships work. And then we have creative inspiration. So I think those things together, combine into an ability for us to make judgment calls that actually do outsmart the artificial intelligence. Our chief scientist here in Australia, Professor Alan Finkel, he said actually we won't get to general artificial intelligence until about 2050 at the earliest. So there's still a lot going for us as directors who have sort of a general, have a general intelligence. But where AI can help us is exactly where Mark was going. It's like, is in our biases. So we've got a disconcerting 188 cognitive biases, the psychologists say. So it's a bit disconcerting that we've got so many of them. And there's a disproportionate number. They say there's just a handful really that punch above their weight in the boardroom in terms of our biases. And often things like success bias. We've been successful. We've been therefore asked to be on a board. Therefore, we're biased about our judgment, for example. So there's quite a number of them. There's also our bias towards social cohesion, which is a positive bias. Biases aren't always negative. And so we often want to keep our boardrooms quite functional and nice and, engaged. And that's a very positive thing. But that can be a bias too, that sometimes we value the social cohesion of the board over the outcomes, the best interests of the company. And Paul, as you were saying about preserving and enhancing the assets of the company. So I actually think really that's where we've got opportunity to use AI in particular, is where we are very biased on particular things. So we need to know about that. And paradoxically, it's usually where we're most biased as directors is often in the things that matter the most, because we're interested in them the most, strategy and our risk appetite that we set for the company. So I think we've got to, again, the other areas also where our general intelligence really has something to offer. So it's about, as other people have said, including the previous speaker, it's about augmentation. None of this is about replacement yet. There might be some replacement in the monitoring side, but I don't think in decision-making we will see a direct replacement at any time soon. I think the other panelists are probably better placed to talk about the specifics, as Mark has done, and I know, Jane might as well, about what people are deploying inside boardrooms. But for me, I always look to other industries and sectors who might be leading ahead of us. And in the area of decision making, I would look to the healthcare industry. They are deploying AI in some quite interesting and novel ways. And there was a paper that I was reading about trying to make the connection between how can corporations in general learn from the AI work in health. And their suggestion was an interesting one. They sort of said, well, look, the AI work we've been doing has been a convergence of being able to map the human genome and then having this enormous amount of data about an individual these days, and then population health data. So they said we can put that all together to actually create sort of quite a very interesting offering and capability around AI. And this person was suggesting in the paper that really corporations are no different. They're a set of components, people, assets, and histories, which could be called the corporate genome. And their thing was, they were saying, well, look, in order to effectively build any AI system that you might then use for decision making, you first of all have to map your corporate genome. That is, you know, what it is that drives you, what's in terms of your business model, your environment, etc. So I thought that was an interesting idea, how we could really draw from some of the leaders in other industries in our decision making sort of space. I mean, on the monitoring side, the second sort of area that I was talking about, opportunity, I think that's actually where the current big wins are at the moment. You know, there's a lot, this is where we aren't as good, I don't believe, as the machine. So our judgment capability is unlimited, you know, this general intelligence, but our data processing is quite limited. And so I think actually there we have a lot of place to actually be helping us with a whole range of assurance roles of oversight. And again, others might speak to some of the detail there, but I think where I might like to comment on where we could use it is in culture. So in the developed capital markets in the last probably 7 years, there's been an enormous focus on the board's role in culture. And there, I think, is great opportunity. There's also great controversy around using AI sort of in that space. So one of my peers here in Australia who leads another advisory firm in the space of board performance, he was quoting this booming text analytics sort of industry that's drawing insights from language used in the workplace within organizations, and saying that there's a firm in the US called Keen Corp, which uses language analysis software of emails to track employee engagement and predict behaviors. And that's probably the controversial bit about privacy and other pieces. But his quote was, while humans remain far more capable of understanding the context and the sentiment of languages, machines are much better at analysing patterns in the vast amount of data. And that's what we need to do as directors. We need to analyse the patterns in our culture or the patterns in any of our compliance sort of spaces. So I think for me, that's just the one I would call out in the monitoring spaces. I think with all the caveats around ethics and privacy, etc., that our monitoring role in culture, which you would have said, oh, look, there's no way we can use data to monitor culture. But there's, I think, some interesting area that's emerging there. And in all of that, it will have implications for directors' duties. And I don't think we're on top of that yet. I think the regulators have been lagging in AI in general. They're catching up, obviously, in some areas, especially in Europe, but even in Singapore, with their sort of standards around AI deployment. But I think we'll be seeing a lot of regulatory activity on the AI role of the boards as well, about how our duties as officers of the company can assure sort of safe and efficient use of AI, you know, so we might have to make sure that we're building in legal precedent, for example, into our monitoring role. And finally, I would just sort of offer that there, I think, are some really interesting places in the board itself. There's two areas, there's quite a lot, but two I would just choose. One is our, if you like, intelligence system of the board, all of our papers that we receive, where some of us prefer not to receive all the papers that we level the papers we get. And that's full of lots of stuff. Sometimes it's data, sometimes it's judgment, sometimes it's a bias, sometimes it's just opinion, sometimes it's actually wisdom. So I actually think there's quite a lot of work, well, there is work being done in that space. So I know of a mid-sized capitalized company on the ASX, the Australian Stock Exchange, and they don't have board papers. They think it's one of the biggest wastes of management time and board time. So what they've done, now they're a technology platform business, so you'd understand that they're quite used to the use of technology. They've created an integrated, so it's a board portal, and interactive board portal that allows directors to inquire into various aspects of the company. So it's integrated into the back-end data systems, and it's interactive. A director can say, I don't want to see the data that way, I want to see it another way. Excuse me. And while they haven't done this yet, I think this is where they'll be heading, is they're also looking to deploy a recommender engine type technology that learns my director interests. What do I pay attention to when I look at the data? What is it that I ask for? What sort of way do I look at the data? When I ask for different sort of way, ask the program to actually cut the data in a different way, and it'll learn to, again, put information towards me. It has its own dangers there as well. And finally, and controversially for us directors, is our own employment, if you like, our own recruitment. So I thought this was a really interesting study out of the Ohio State University. It's actually a collaboration with Washington and Colorado universities as well. Excuse me, where they were using publicly available data to create an algorithm that was called XGboost that they believe can actually predict the success of individual directors. So it's a bit controversial, and can identify which directors are likely to be unpopular with shareholders. Although sometimes I think you have to be unpopular with shareholders to be a good director, but this was their brief of the XGboost algorithm. And this was their quote. It says, the differences between the directors suggested by the algorithm and those selected by firms allows us to assess the features that are overrated in director nominations process in terms of what we as humans think makes a good director and what the machines think based on data. It appears that firms choose directors who are much more likely to be male, have a large network, have a lot of board experience, currently serve on more boards, and have a finance background. A machine learning algorithm, which is much more sophisticated than the algorithms relied on by psychologists, would allow firms to improve their board selection process. So that's a bit controversial, and for me it's bad news because I just about have all of those things, being an ex-accountant like yourself, Paul. But I think that's something to pay attention to as well, is how could that utilise our ability to appoint and remove some of our biases. So in closing, I just simply say, look, it's a big space, and some people might be going, well, there's a lot in there, where do we start? My advice always to boards is to start with a pain point, to choose an area that AI or machine learning or data analytics has the capacity to help us with, and that's painful to us in the organisation at the moment, and start small and get some early wins. Because at the end of the day, I think what we need to move from, to colleague has coined this term, this idea that we're know-it-all directors and we have to become learn-it-all directors. So I think, Paul, I'll leave it there.
Hi, Mr. Paul, can you unmute, please?
Okay. Thanks, Andrew, for your very informative presentation. One thing that I highlighted to me is that if you're so relying on the of the right, it really depends on who programmed it, how our algorithm been structured, right? To an extent that I think it may cause a lot of human beings to be worried about AI, right? But in actual fact, AI is a very strategic, not only enabling, as I said, it is a strategic imperative tool for us to use together with human beings, all right? I still remember that in the old days, in the year 2000, when we first started to putting together the governance framework, we've had a Green Book on corporate governance. The very important thing is to put together the various committee to have a balance in terms of how to govern the company. And the accountants, the financial experts, so-called, are always the very focal point that you must have in your board, all right? So we have the audit committee, all right, which is usually headed by the accountants. I think today, okay, to the technology side, there's a shift in terms of the importance of digital. Now we call it AI, perhaps the AI director, going to that field. Okay, so the issue is that if we program our AI algorithm with that kind of qualification, then you'll find that most of the selection, more move towards technology, selection of directors, right? So, but do human beings still make decision? That's a big question, right? So, to your point, we have to be very careful, I think, that we need to have a balance between the enabling tools and against human intelligence, right? So that's a question that we always bring up to the board, you know. Experience introduction of AI in business processes made for the governing board. Right? And you do not even know the extent of AI in business that they govern. Even in Australia, are the boards in Australia very familiar with the introduction of AI into the governance framework?
You wanted me to answer that now, Paul, or later?
Yes, because it's relating to what you presented just now.
Yeah, sure. No, look, Australia, unfortunately, in this area, we've been leaders in corporate governance, as you would know, for decades. We are not leaders, unfortunately, in AI deployment inside the boardroom. I think we have been looking to, in particular, we are looking and have been to Singapore and to Europe. Germany is a standout, but the European Union in general for this sort of area. I think, though, to your point about the need to constantly be changing and there are people coming on for the ride, I think people are recognising that there needs to be change. Now, of course, this is a generalisation. There are some standout examples, and it's usually to do with the business model and to the ease of deployment of these technologies, and that they're already well advanced and they just suit the need of the organisation. So I think we're early days here, unfortunately. I think we need to pick up. But there are those examples. And again, it's interesting that the example I was gave before, it's mid-cap, it's not the big end of town. They are deploying it inside the organisation themselves. Finance is doing an enormous amount in Australia around credit risk, market risk, etc. But it's not at boardroom level, it's at operational or management decision-making. So that's great. But again, I think we need to be looking to what management's doing. Often we forget that inside our organisations there's a lot more boards could learn. So I think we've got a task ahead of us.
Yeah, I think that there's an enormous task ahead of us. All of us are so well familiar with the IR 4.0, Industrial Revolution 4.0, all right, which is increasingly very prevalent in every industry, every profession, right? So the biggest question is whether the board members are ready for that, right? AI is one of the very key technology, but then well, you know. So I wonder whether and from a board level, all right, we got to consider migrating to governance 4.0, governance framework around all this technology we're talking. But otherwise, you find that the board themselves are lagging very much behind, and the operational level, they are moving very fast ahead, and yet the board has holding the purse string to make decision, right? If they're not familiar, how would they make a decision on important issues like that? But if they don't, the market will decide for them. The market will move away. All right. So my question just now about the to what extent that even the board are familiar with the AI in the business that they govern, you know, which is so important. What you have brought up now. So, governance 4.0.
Yeah, and it goes to Mark's point before about competence.
Yeah,
it just goes to Mark's point before.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, Mark might have a comment on this too about competency as well. So some of the reasons why people aren't engaging with it in boardrooms is they don't know how to have the conversation. But we can learn. We didn't know how to have the conversation on board's role in organisational culture. We didn't even know how to have it on, say, risk appetite setting before the global financial crisis. So we are quite good at learning how to have a conversation, but we need to learn very fast about how to have a conversation on AI. And you're right, Paul, I did a speech on artificial intelligence in the boardroom in Hong Kong last year, and it was a fairly small audience, but I used some technology, just a conference technology to do an audience poll, and they were company directors. And I said, well, how prepared are your boards? And 57% said that their boards were not ready to adopt digital advances in the boardroom. And 7% said that their boards were actively resisting it or undermining management's attempts to bring AI to the boardroom. So I think we've got some way to go there.
Yeah. we have, all of us have a long way to go, and the business usually thrusts ahead in response to the various competition into the industry that they are in, right? And usually the regulatory part will come in following very closely to that, or sometimes very distant from that. With that, I would like to introduce Jane Dipla. She's from the regulatory side, and perhaps I think she can help us to understand the thinking of the regulators in involving in this development of AI in industry. So briefly, let me introduce Jane to you, right? Jane, chairman of Abu Dhabi Regulatory Committee in the global market. She's also a director in Singapore's Exchange Limited. She's the current chair of the Governance and Nomination Committee of the International Integrated Reporting Council, or IIRC. And she's also a director on the Australian Financial Service Group. She's a member of the Public Interest Oversight Board, a member of the International Advisory Committee of China Securities Regulatory Commission, as well as a member of the International Advisory Committee Board of the Securities and Exchange Board of India. So we have a very experienced regulators before. The recent role that she held was the chairman of the Executive Committee of the International Organization for Securities Commission, or ISCO. She was also the former chairman of the Securities Commission of New Zealand. Right. So we are very, very experienced person in Jane to help us regulators in meeting all these changes that the marketplace is actually sometimes struggling to survive. Right. So how do these regulations and the marketplace work cohesively? These two ought to be sort of I would say that they are the two sides of the same coin, right? They ought to be working very closely together. So I would say that you look at a coin, on one side is stem on the sovereignty of the country. On the other side of the coin is stem the value of the coin. So this is where the marketplace is the value, and the sovereignty also at the other side for the regulators to play a very effective role. So over to you, Jane.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you firstly for inviting me today, and I'm delighted to see one of my two of my fellow countrymen, because I am both an Australian and a New Zealander, on this panel. So I think we're very, very well represented. Paul, I'd just like to start by just some general comments about AI, perhaps. Certainly some of the boards I'm on use it to some extent, but it seems to depend largely on the business model, the ambition of the directors of the company, and their maturity in the technological journey, really, as to how actively or otherwise they are engaging with AI. And I think the purposes of AI and how they're used in the company really depend a lot on what sort of a company you're talking about. I mean, I think in the traditional sense, AI was first used really to reduce the workload on people. So very dangerous occupations, repetitive occupations, and using human judgment as input into the AI processing. And I think our previous speaker very elegantly outlined the balance between Dr. Berlin, I'm saying, about human judgment and the machine learning element in AI, and how they can work together. So I guess if we're looking from the regulatory side, it's really at the moment a patchwork quilt of bits of regulation that affect various parts of the AI journey, and companies are affected by them either domestically or internationally, depending on where they do business and on how they do business. So if you look in Europe, Europe is quite mature in its response to some of the risks involved in machine learning, data analytics and AI, in looking at privacy, trying to help companies understand fundamentally who owns the data, who can monetize it, what it can be used for, what the limitations are, and tries to give some certainty about those issues. In other parts of the world, it's really still the Wild West as far as the use of that data is concerned, and the monetization of it, and whether there's any informed consent. And I think someone else made the point that we, in desperation to download the free app or read the free newspaper, we click on something that says, I accept whatever it is, and very few people read it. So is that really informed consent if that data is later monetized or used in some other way? So I think from the regulatory perspective, it's a very immature regulatory framework at the moment. And I think there have been some very interesting questions asked about whether there is a need for some sort of global standards in relation to this space. I was reading an interesting article by Marcus Beto from Harvard, the Harvard University stable, and he was pointing out that an interesting dilemma in the MIT moral machine, which is looking at autonomous vehicles and trying to work out if there is going to be an accident, who should bear the damage. And all sorts of moral and ethical issues arise about what sort of judgment should be fed into the algorithms that make the vehicle, one vehicle, do more damage than another through, and you know, where did that data come from, and what was it, how was it actually formulated? So I think it's a very, very difficult question to unpack, and I don't think regulators have yet really got their arms around it. Another element is that although we feel in our cloud-based universe that we're absolutely swimming in AI, that everywhere you look, from buying your groceries online during lockdown or buying a book on Amazon, somehow someone's scraping your data and using it and you don't really know where it goes. Nevertheless, there's still a lot of digitization yet to come. And some areas of data use are not really digitized in a way that there are taxonomies. Now, I'm just wondering whether, I'm sure Paul is still here. I can't see him, but I'm sure he's still here. I'm wondering.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. No, thank you. Good. So the whole question of non-financial data, for example, we know that IFRS and US GAAP for reporting purposes have taxonomies that are well recognized and can be used and machine read quite readily. But the non-financial data is an alphabet soup of standard setters around the world. And one of the most exciting things I think that's been happening recently globally is the coming together of those 5 of those standard setters, facilitated by IMP and the wonderful Clara Barbie, to come together to make a statement of intent that they intend to work together to get digitized forms of non-financial data into a form that can be machine readable around the world. And I'm honoured to be chairing a steering committee of that digitization working group, non-financial digitization working group. So there's certainly a lot of energy being put into this space to help boards and companies to actually start to manage their data and to report on it in an integrated way. And the Integrated Reporting Council, as some of you will have seen, has just announced a merger with SASB, the Sustainable Standard Setting Board in the US, and that is going to be bring together those 2 organizations as part of hopefully a further consolidation of non-financial reporting standard setters. So there is a lot of activity, but I think from the board's point of view, that depending on your business model, AI can be enormously helpful. I'd just like to make one point about cognitive bias. I'm not convinced that actually we are insulated by AI from cognitive bias, because whoever actually puts the data in that formulates the algorithm can already have put into that process cognitive bias. And I know that there's a famous report of some employment statistics that were used, and the machine learning came out that actually certain roles were only suitable for men, because the statistics that went in there was that there were very few women currently in those roles. So it perhaps what rubbish in, rubbish out is equally a suitable motto for the formation of algorithms. And that really brings me to some of the responsibilities of the fiduciary duties of directors in relation to this. And I think it's pretty clear that the governance of data is going to be an increasingly important part of the fiduciary duties of directors. And an understanding of how AI is used in the boardroom. I suspect that in some boardrooms, AI is being used by management for certain purposes, perhaps for fraud detection, perhaps for audit purposes, perhaps for compliance, but it's not necessarily badged as AI. It's badged as a use of computers to help bring this about, because AI, the very two letters might make people think that something really quite mysterious is happening, rather than really an effort to actually improve the outputs where human cognitive effort would be very difficult to get the same result. So I think the second point I'd like to make is that AI is enormously useful where it can add a great deal of time saving and efficiencies, but in some areas which are fundamental to board decisions, those of values, those of culture, and I'm interested to hear Andrew's commentary on that. And I think there'll be an interesting philosophical debate as to whether the data out of the emails will give a robust assessment of the culture or not. And I'd be open to hear that debate anytime. I think it'd be fascinating. But there is a need for companies to articulate their purpose. And this is, if we're going to look at the business to lead the economic recovery post-COVID, I think the pathway is there, and that is in the UN SDGs. And if companies can look at the way that they will impact and the implementation of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals using machine readable data, using AI, I think it'll be very helpful. And then it's very important that companies do embrace this. I agree. I think it'll be both an enabler and a distinguisher. I think it'll happen at the same time. And boards will increasingly realize that this is something which, used properly, used sensibly, can help. And the next point I'd like to make is regulators are increasingly asking for modeling to take place for climate change in particular through the Task Force on Climate Disclosures, but also in New Zealand, for example, it's just been announced that all listed companies will need to actually respond to climate change. And the modeling process that's made available by machine learning and AI will be enormously helpful in this. We've all, as directors, said to each other we should have over-the-horizon radar. Well, perhaps in a strange way, we have over-the-horizon radar. And it might be partly through the predictability capacity of AI. And the last thing I'd like to just throw out there and hear what the other members of the panel think is, somebody said to me the other day, data is the new plastic. It's everywhere, it's ubiquitous, it's thrown away, it's used and thrown away. We should be thinking of it perhaps in a way in which we we protect it, take care of it, look after it, and be not quite as perhaps libertine in its use and misuse. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Jane. It's very enlightening the way you present it. And there's something that I've learned today is data is a new plastic.
I'm not owning that. I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah, is it a new oil or something like that, or new electricity, which in a way is plastic. After using it, we throw it away, right? And much of the data that we use has always been just put it even used there. But in today's environment, I'm sure that we are aware data is the most valuable asset for the company. And this is where, as a CPA, as an accountant myself, I would struggle with it. Where is it reflected in the value of the company? It's never reflected in the balance sheet that data is of any value, right? So that is where, again, the challenges the board to rethink how do we define what is asset. I like that you brought up the issue of the consolidation of the IRC, the International Integrated Reporting Council, and SASB, the Standard Accounting, Sustainability Accounting Standard Board, right? Now, because you find that the market has changed so tremendously, the data that we throw it away, we don't put a value to it, but those who know how to use it, how to create an algorithm to use it, those are tremendous value to the company, right? And if the board doesn't see that way, I think that we may be not fully discharged to the stakeholder shareholders that we serve. Here, when they present our report, the annual report, we present only the financial statement of how the companies perform financially. So if what you said about the data, the new plastic or the new recyclable value, if you don't look into that, we are grossly under serving our fiduciary responsibility, right? And this is where just now I mentioned that you have two countrymen that you're working with. In a way that I'm also working with you on the integrated reporting. I'm the IRC ambassador. And for one, we have to redefine, that's from the accounting perspective, what is capital, right? So far we define capital is the actual financial, the human that you invest in as capital, right? It's not reflecting the balance sheet. We don't put in the intellectual capital as a value, just like what you said about data, right? So it's incumbent on the board, therefore, to look at the new market that we are operating within, that look at the value of the company in a very different perspective. I'd like to share with you my thought on this. In 2016, I came with a very interesting book called The End of Accounting. As an accountant, it triggers me because of its provocative title, right? And what I found out was that the research are serving our consumer or customers, so to say, giving assured financial report. But the customers, usually the largest part is actually the investor themselves, right? How frequent would the investor look in the financial reporting to make a forward decision? Most of the time, investment is such a forward decision. It's not a bad review, right? So that research done by two professors was very interesting. And they found that they look at the financial report in fact, they say less than 5% of the time. Most of the time, the information they gather was from non-audited sources, market intelligence, the business analysts, and filing with the regulators, all these things, and much of which are not audited, and much of which does not reflect in the balance sheet. So what a challenge that I find from the board is that we have to redefine what is asset, what is capital, and so on and so forth, which the IIRC framework has a very good framework for us to work along. But having said that, we also understand the massive amount of data need to flow through the process before we can come up with the report, right? And as you're aware that today, the ESG has come into play. In Malaysia, sustainable reporting is mandatory since 2019 last year. And the 17 governance code has embedded the large companies should do integrated reporting, right? And as you're aware that the United Nations accounting as the development goals, which can be implemented in the next times. Now, all these things are very massive. how do we grasp all this, right? So I think it is really timely that with the technology like AI, whether we can pull all this information together and generate out the report. At the end of the day, you know, this is a challenge for the board. So this in response to the interesting analogy you give just now, data is the new plastic. We should recycle all the plastic. Okay, but let me go through some questions that any one of you can take it up, all right? There are ethical issues in using all this AI, right? Are there other ethical issues the board needs to get in the use of AI? For example, as supply chains, the logistics may present reputation and other risks, as well as the opportunities and efficiency. Now, we deal with a lot of the value chain of whatever that we do. We have working along with the logistics, the supply chains. What if the supply chains themselves is the weak chain is a weak link to us? Now, as you're aware, that in the US, they have this FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practice Act, right? It goes right down to the line of the company, the directors themselves managing the company, right down to the line of their employees or of their staff, and ensuring that the company doesn't practice any illegality, right? It doesn't practice any corruption or bribery and things like that. If it is not detected, the company right will get into trouble. Okay. Now, how do we put up a sort of some kind of a platform be able to detect that, or at least put in place the mechanism to safeguard employees corruption? So AI can be utilized to do that, right? How do we do that? Jane, you have some answers?
Just wanted to add to your question, actually, Paul. Members of the panel will probably be aware that the Swiss government recently had a referendum on whether company directors should be legally liable for malfeasance in their supply chain. And so, perhaps surprisingly, it was lost by a very, very slim margin. So it seems to me that it might be a canary in the coal mine for company directors elsewhere in the world, that supply chain issues are becoming increasingly important. And certainly some companies are now using blockchain or other ways of attempting to lock down various pieces of the supply chain and to have them audited in some way. And I think there's some hope, at least in some of the work that I've been doing with people involved in the digitization of non-financial reporting, that if the digitized process can be made so SMEs could use it, because most participants in some of these supply chains are small or medium enterprises, then that could assist in actually some sort of electronic monitoring of the supply chain and assurance to the board of directors of the final receiving company of those suppliers that issues like human slavery or other environmental pollution or other issues are not alive and well in their supply chain. So I just like to reinforce your question, that I think it's a very important one.
Mark, I did on the question about supply chain.
Thanks, Paul. Well, I'm just thinking, I mean, we are really a supplier, so and dealing with banks, tier 1 banks, and they are putting a lot of onus and responsibility on us in terms of ethical standards. Now, they're not using AI per se to audit us, but obviously they have audit obligations on us. So it's interesting, you know, this comes into sustainability, anti-slavery, ethical performance of suppliers. So we're seeing an awful lot of that come in from the banking sector right now. And just picking up a few of the other points and just looking at you know, the potential bias in AI and some of the technology we're using now in facial recognition. And I think it's probably well known by some of the panelists that, you know, there's some, because of the test population that's used on facial recognition, there are some ethnic origins that where facial recognition technology doesn't work as well. And that's just an example of something creeping in because of its test base. So, you know, you have to be very careful. It's the same old basis. You've got to look at clear, high standard data going into any model. And the other thing I was, you know, just talking about, just when we use, just where boards are in terms of use of AI. So, you know, I run a company where we are using AI within the operation as such, but I suspect that in many boards, the last place they would consider AI technology was actually in the boardroom. They're saying, that's really an IT role, I'll just do my standard role. So, you know, we're going to have a pretty dramatic change, I think, in attitudes across a lot of the boards in New Zealand, and I suspect Australia as well, from what Andrew and Jane were saying.
There is one question, Mark, perhaps that you have answered part of the question. I will read a question to you from the audience. It said, regarding algorithm bias, if data has built-in biases, then AI will carry this bias through the output. How should board of directors ensure this risk is managed if AI is adopted in your organization? Relating to your answer just now. The question is, how should board directors ensure this risk if AI is adopted in the organization?
Well,
you like to
we're not using AI to assess or measure that technology. In other words, AI to measure AI, but we do have audit and risk compliance. So there are a lot of stopgaps within the company, and, you know, obviously other operations and sectors. So, you know, any model that you're putting up, whether it be AI or technology or not, has got to go through the same testing rigor, and then have an audit and a circuit breaker option, so you can at least review it. So I don't, to be honest, think that's much different. Potentially we could use AI to audit AI, and maybe Andrew would have a comment on that, but really I think it's really just standard processes that we have in the board to measure any other algorithm that we would produce.
Yeah. Well, if I can come in there, yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting area. That's where I go to, is AI, yes, auditing AI, but I'm not sure that we're there yet. And then maybe it's just one bias auditing another bias, perhaps, as well, to Jane's point. And I think the good thing is that for the last 7 years, there's been a very active engagement on that bias piece, because, you know, it really wasn't noticed there until some of these examples sort of came up. I think the one, Jane, was either Google or it was Amazon that had that issue when they had to shut down their employment process, and it was because, you know, someone hadn't, to your point, Mark, just the standard processes that you would have probably applied just to recruitment, nothing to do with AI, weren't put into place around that, and it was filtering out. The reason it was thinking that, yes, because there was a sort of a limited pool of successful people in this area that happened to be male, they then used in their CVs, they were filtering out anything, like anyone who played softball or netball, for example. There was filtering out things like that. I mean, that's not an AI issue. That's just a basic sort of, you know, process issue that a HR sort of audit type process should have picked up. So I think you're right, Mark. I think that's in the future, AI auditing AI, but I think at the moment it's standard processes. But I don't think boards have built it into their risk management frameworks. I've yet to see in any meaningful sense in a risk appetite statement, and that's the board's purvey, is setting a risk appetite statement. Risk profiling and risk management in large organisations is usually much more of a management task these days. But at the risk appetite level, I'm not seeing boards saying, this is our appetite for AI risk, and where are we willing to go to, you know, to Paul's point, to make it a differentiator. We're going to take some risk, and where is that? And so have some parameters around what we're willing and not willing to, putting some red lines there around what we're not willing to, which goes to that point about the supply chain as well. And I just think we're not yet having those conversations. One area I think we could look from boards of health organisations, especially the larger hospitals, is ethics committees. Now, some people on ethics, I've never been on an ethics committee myself, and I always thought they could be the holy grail for all sorts of issues, but colleagues of mine who are on them say, don't hold your breath, Andrew, because they just become very administrative like audit committees too. But I think the concept of them could be utilised at board level around ethics committees for a range of things, not just AI, but also supply chain and other things. So again, I think we need to create the forums and the places to have these conversations with skilled directors who know how to have the conversation.
Okay, good, Andrew. There are 3 related questions talking about how to start, all right? So what type of AI-based topics or learning areas that board members should focus on as a start? How do they start? The question related to that is, which area of operations do you think AI could add the most value? Has that been explored? And the third same issue was that what training is provided to upgrade skills in the existing company workforce to allow them to assist the company with the AI journey? What are the board's and management plans to fill the knowledge gap? So some of these answers will be interesting. Andrew, since you have conducted talks on this area, give some idea to the new board. Yeah.
Well, could I just trouble you to just give me the first part of that 3-part question, because I didn't quite catch the first part.
Sure, okay. The first part question is that what types of AI-based topics or learning areas that board members should focus on as a start? How do they start?
Yeah, so, and that was sort of, I think where I left off, or the end of it was, I think you can take 2 approaches. I've seen boards largely just try to paint a big picture around AI, and that's a bit daunting, and I don't know that it's all effective. So every single of one of our very large banks in Australia sent their boards over to Silicon Valley for a bit of a tour around and a look at technology in general, but including artificial intelligence. Now that's all very well and good, but I think I would hesitate to say, I probably shouldn't say this, but that could be seen as a vanity exercise rather than actually an exercise based on a specific need inside the corporation. And I'm sure they were very structured and they probably were very needs-based. But I would recommend that people sit down and have that conversation about where are our pain points? What are the issues? Well, it could be an opportunity too, not just a pain point. It could be, as you're saying again, Paul, about a differentiator. And then choosing that area to learn about AI rather than trying to go out and, do an AI course in general, etc. Having said that, and again, to Mark's point, I do think there's some basic knowledge and even language that people need to have. Again, I really feel like I struggle sometimes to even have the conversation. So I do think directors need to go out and do training. There are some great courses out there. The one that seems to have got a lot of traction, at least in the Asia Pacific region, is the MIT Sloan course on sort of artificial intelligence in business decision making. It's for senior executives and boards, but there are other great courses out there as well. So I think boards need to be doing that sort of piece, and then you need to choose your topics based, I think, on the information sort of needs once you've got a general sort of understanding. And importantly, to the last comment we've made, is I think we need to have, the topics need to be around risk and AI and ethics and AI as well. I might leave it there and let the other panelists sort of choose which parts of the question they want to comment on, and I can always come back.
Jane, you have any comments?
Thanks, Paul. I think I actually agree with Andrew. I don't think AI is something that is holistic, a sort of miasma of stuff. It's actually something that your business needs will lead you to, or you might want to take as an initiative to enhance your current business model. But I think it needs to be thoroughly thought out in a strategic sense as to what are the important matters that are both fit AI and and to use the question of enabler or differentiator, it can be an enabler, and that can be where you start. On the personal journey, I actually think that in the midst of this 4th industrial revolution, every board member who has some area of expertise should be trying to continually learn how this technological revolution is going to affect their particular area of expertise. So if you're a financial expert, if you're an audit expert, if you're an engineering expert, you should try and upskill. And I think that upskilling is the responsibility of all directors, to be constantly upskilling. And this area is one that I think everybody has a responsibility to learn more about. And I certainly feel that responsibility myself. I'm by no means as expert as I'd like to be. And I think many directors have the same feeling and are working energetically to try and learn more about it.
Yeah. There's one question to talk about. AI is a big word for traditional businessmen and small businesses, right? They have the fear of being overtaken by AI, but not willing to ask, how can we motivate this group of individuals to embrace this? So we're talking about generally not only the big public listed company, but the SMIs, small medium enterprises and small medium industries. There are many businessmen like that. When they look at AI, it is really such a big word. They really don't know where to start, whether it is even necessary to embrace. So the question is that how can we motivate this group of individuals to embrace AI? Anyone want to jump in?
You know what, Paul, it's interesting in terms of embracing AI. So, talking to one of the senior risk managers at a tier 1 bank in New Zealand, we were talking about AI and predictive algorithms we could produce. And he said, you know what, don't give me something new and fandangled. What I want is something that will help me do what I do now quicker, more efficiently, or cheaper. So go away and bring me that. And I think in some ways, when we're considering, where would we start with AI? I think it's about what would make us more efficient or quicker at something we already do, and start there, and then it will just evolve.
And Paul, if I could add that, I have done and do quite a bit of work with private companies, and that's been a number of my chairing roles have been in private companies. And so at the trailer company, it's the 3rd largest semi-trailer manufacturer in Australia that I chaired for 7 years. I realised early on, this is a family company to 3 generations, and I realised early on that I could bring in as many experts as I liked, and I could talk about frameworks and theory and all the rest of it, but they needed to see it. They needed to see it living and breathing, whatever it is I was talking about. So I had been going on about some lean manufacturing and some safety arrangements and some cultural aspects around manufacturing processes for years, and was getting some, but not a lot of traction, and certainly no real buy-in. And so General Motors unfortunately shut down here in manufacturing here in Australia and in Victoria, my state in Melbourne. And so the outgoing head of their manufacturing offered me to take the board and the senior executive around on a tour before they shut down while they were still operating. And in that 1.5 day, I got more change out of all the things that I wanted because they could see it. They could see it. And those sorts of I'm generalizing again, but SME type directors, they're quite practical, pragmatic people that want to just get stuff done. And when they can see something, and it's when it's a peer, like a General Motors, they're in the manufacturing sort of transport manufacturing industry. So they were a peer that they respected, obviously much, much, much larger than they were. So if you can combine the showing of them with respect, so I think taking them out and showing them, or somehow showing them how peers that they respect are using AI, is the way to get some of these people to start engaging with it.
Very good. You know what, for the businessman, for the entrepreneurs, they always look at a very pragmatic situation. How does it help me in my business? All right, very, very down to earth type of question. So therefore, if you talk about technology, if you talk about all the complicated metrics and all those things, they're not quite interested. How do I run my company? And I'm, especially in COVID situation, I'm already so tight with my cash flow. What am I going to do? How do you manage the overheads? The bills you're going to pay and all the stuff. So they're very practical people. I think area which you cannot disagree agree that the innovation, the market technology advancement is so rapid, right? And we can't avoid that. I think it's also the cultural issue, that the mindset, right? How are we going to embrace it, or how are we going to, if not really the leader, but at least near the curve, how to embrace that, you know? So I look at it this way, that this a lot to do with the mindset. If you adopt a mindset, a culture of innovation is always coming up, and we embrace it as if it is part and parcel of our life, you know, not something that we should be fearful about. And secondly, for the business people, if you have a culture of value creation, regardless of whatever technology, regardless of whatever frontiers that have been invaded by technology and so on and so forth, all right, we do, what value can we come to the organization that we represent, right? So the value is something that is not diminished by, you may say, or disruption, you know. So I think, back to the question that one of you guys mentioned about the culture of the company, developing the whole company frame kind of view of continuing to embrace innovation and continue to embrace value creation, that I think would lead the company to the next level without fear, you know, really very purposeful, moving towards the same direction. What do you think? Does it make sense? Any one of you can comment?
I'm happy to kick off. I don't want to be speaking too much, but I think this is a struggle for a lot of boards, is the innovation place. We get to a place where, you know, one of our roles is stability, is to keep a company stable, and to your point right up front, Paul, about, you know, declining lifespans of companies. So we sometimes have a bias against innovation and change and ideas. So I think what we have to do is we have to hardwire it into the board. We have to hardwire it either in terms of the people we're putting onto the board. But again, you don't want to have your token innovation person there, but it's then also hardwiring it into the relationships the board has with other people. So to me, where I've seen boards be always thinking, even if they're quite conservative boards in conservative, mature industries, where they remain innovative is when they have partners in their business model that are usually a startup or somebody else. They're vital to their business, and they spend time with those startups. They spend time with the founders and the boards, and they use those parts of the ecosystem that are going to innovate much better than they are. One of our leading banks realised that trying to innovate in the area of technology inside the bank killed things faster than, you know, than they could create new opportunities. So basically, they partnered with a lot of fintechs outside through a vehicle. They set up an investment vehicle, essentially a private equity vehicle of their own within the bank. And that allowed the board then to stay very close to some very interesting initiatives and ideas. And I think that's one of the ways I think boards need to, again, not go out and do some sort of tour. They need to have it built into their business engagement on a day-to-day basis. There are a lot of people, innovation going on in the ecosystem, and we just need to make sure that comes into the boardroom through various conversations.
Okay. All right. Anyone else has any input?
Paul, I might just say I'm hopeful that technology will assist this to some extent, that there will be ways in which the smaller entities will be able to use a form of AI or machine reading anyway of material that will enable greater efficiencies. And as they see those efficiencies develop, they will embrace the technology further. It's a sort of gloss, I think, on part of the way that Andrew was talking about. It's about, and Mark, it's about seeing and believing and then embracing. So I think there is a journey, but it's a journey for all companies, I think, at the moment. So it's not, but it's important that the small to medium enterprises that are part of the supply chains of other companies, that they do embrace it and understand it, I think.
Yes, absolutely. I think that if we were to position the AI as a business imperative, then business people can there's always the risk-reward element. If they don't do it, they could be out of the business. That is how we communicate this idea to them is very, very important. So it's like cybersecurity, it's not a technical issue. It's a board issue, it's a business issue, similarly to AI. There's one interesting question I just want to put up to you, see whether you have some answers. Let me see. Okay. This question is from somebody talking about AI will be the new normal in business operation. How will this affect the appointment of the board members so that non-intelligent or qualified board members, for example, politicians, are less eligible to be appointed? Interesting question.
That's a non-intelligent or non-intelligent?
Non-intelligent, yeah, unqualified. That's especially politician, is it?
Well, look, I think all boards are now
how you build the algorithm, right?
Yeah, I think all boards are looking at their makeup right now, and that's a part diversity, but still to meet the challenge of changing technology. And it's important. I mean, if we think, you know, the average age of board members in public companies globally probably needs to come down as we need board members that embrace new technology. And, you know, that's just part and parcel of making sure we're energizing and reinventing ourselves as companies. So I think it will make a difference because if you don't engage in AI or new technologies, then, you know, how can your company match its competition?
I think that's absolutely true. I think the average global is 3. In Malaysia, KPMG did a study about 2 years ago. Average age of independent directors is 60. Okay, so with the new technology, AI coming in, that is definitely a challenge, right? So, some court recommended that the company, all right, ought to have a AI council in the board. Right, to continually, intentionally move forward, you know, to implementation of the new technology, rather than leave it and let it flow. And usually the audit committee or the risk management committee will take this up. And largely they may not be well equipped. So what do you think of this, having an AI committee in the board or AI council in the board, consistently helping the board to understand the whole spectrum of how AI impacting the business? Would it be a direction, you think?
Paul, I think it might be, to me, it'll be a transition arrangement because we've done this before in all sorts of areas. We have these fads in boards, and so we create sort of, you know, like the people committee, or we created the marketing committee about, you know, 15 years ago. We were all into marketing and being customer driven, etc. But I actually think they can be quite useful as a transition engagement to bring the attention and the training about competency of the board. But then I would want to see it embedded in the board's processes. I would want to see it in the audit committee, but I'd also want to see it in the nominations and remunerations committee when it's thinking, to Mark's point about recruitment. You know, so I think, you know, I as a transition, I think that it's very useful to upskill, to get focus, and then I'd want to see it integrated.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now there's actually a few other questions, but I think we are running short of time. For those whom we haven't answered the question, the organizer will reply to you by email. All right. Thank the excellent panel speakers here to give us a lot of ideas, and I hope that it's been helpful to the participants. So if there's any further question, please just send your email to the organizer, and we will respond accordingly. So thank you very much, Mark, Andrew, and Jane, for your participation. There's a lot of good information, and I hope that we can compile it and disseminate to the participants in due time, right? So thank you very much. I'll hand over this session back to the organizer.